Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to ISNA's Friday Reflections. We want to welcome you all to today's program. For today's program, we have with us Dr. Rania Awaad. We want to thank her for her time today. Inshallah, I will be briefly introducing her and then we'll ask her to begin her talk. Dr. Rania Awaad is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine, where she is also the director of the Muslim Mental Health Lab and director of the Diversity Clinic. She is also the clinical director of the San Francisco Bay Area branches of the Khalil Center, a spiritual wellness center pioneering the application of traditional Islamic spiritual healing methods to modern clinical psychology. Prior to studying medicine, she pursued classical Islamic studies in Syria and holds certifications in Quran, Islamic law, and other branches of Islamic sciences. We welcome Dr. Rania, so please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with Asna and of course Mina. Bismillah. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala al-hadi Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'een. MashaAllah, in today's Friday reflection, what I hope to speak about is a verse of the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches all of us and reminds us that in difficult times like the ones we find ourselves in, particularly when we are not feeling well, He has taught us in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينَ, to say that when I am unwell, it is He, Allah, who heals me. وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who has the ability to heal us. And honestly, in the last several months, it has been an incredibly difficult time for all of us. In fact, I would say that there's not a single one of us, without exception, that hasn't experienced some amount of difficulty or turmoil, COVID and quarantine, and now news of more spikes of COVID, all the civil unrest and oppression that's been happening here nationally, and also the ongoing turmoil globally, and so much more that has so many of us really having and experiencing moments of uncertainty and distress. For some of us, this uncertainty has actually escalated into anxiety. Many of us have also experienced sadness that has escalated for some into depression. Many of us have experienced panic or fear, and almost all of us at some point have felt overwhelmed at one point or another, certainly some more than others. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that it is He, Azza wa Jal, who restores us back to health and well-being. And sometimes this can happen on its own, but sometimes we actually need the help of others to get better. And we often call these people doctors, physicians, but it's important to note that in our traditional Islamic societies and in our understanding of the traditional Islamic system, that the realm of healing was not limited to the atibba, the physicians. That in fact, our tradition is very holistic in its manner in which it works in treatment and healing. And we incorporate all aspects of well-being, not just physical well-being. And I'm going to come back to this point because it's incredibly important. And I would also say unique to the Islamic tradition. Sisters and brothers, I'm going to share with you a little bit as to why or what has inspired me to do the work I do in bridging the Islamic teachings along with the field that I'm in, which is mental health. And you see, for me, my first field of study was actually the Islamic sciences. I studied the deen first. And I was classically trained in the Islamic sciences of Islamic law and theology before studying medicine. And for me, what that did was set a very important stage that you never study any science of any sort in a vacuum without considering Islam. And this is what our noble predecessors had done. In fact, when you look at their biographies, you're always wowed by the fact that all of them had accomplished, were huffaz of Quran and had studied all the traditional Islamic sciences before they became a famous mathematician or a famous physician and so on. And I really felt that if we looked closely enough into the works of our great predecessors, those who came before us, that we would actually find that in their works that they also spoke about this concept of holistic healing that Islam teaches us about. But you don't hear in our community the topic or word mental health very commonly. And you certainly don't hear that it had something to do with our noble predecessors. And this was who I was and how I grew up as well. Had no interest in this field and didn't think it had anything to do with a Muslim. In fact, I didn't take a single psychology course in college because I felt, what is this nonsense? And I know many of you share the same sentiments. And I was in your shoes one day too. But when I looked closely enough at the works of our scholars, what I found in our tradition is that, and when you have to translate some of the works, because the majority of them are still in the primary Arabic language, but you find that they actually spoke of exactly this concept of holistic healing, and they certainly did not ignore emotional and mental well-being. And why am I saying all this? Why do I bring this story today? Because so many of us are feeling overwhelmed. We're feeling panicked by the news. We're feeling distressed by everything that's happening around us. And often we end up separating and feeling like these are separate things that have nothing to do with Islam. But it is far from so. Let me tell you. Here at Stanford, I direct a lab called the Stanford Muslims and Mental Health Lab. And there's many lines of research, but one in particular that I really value and love so much is our historical line, where we go into the primary texts of our noble predecessors and see what they said. How did they understand? What were their perceptions of the world and of healing around them? What inspired them to become the great people they became? As Muslims, we pride ourselves so much on our golden age, right? All the advancements of medicine and science and humanities. But nobody has ever said anything much about the advancements in mental health in that era. But did you know, subhanAllah, that there were people in that era who spoke so much of this topic that they made leaps and bounds of advancements? And I'll tell you, this will all tie back as to why I'm bringing this up, but let me tell you about one in particular. In the manuscripts I was looking through and in the research we do, there was many who caught my attention, but there was one in particular who really caught my attention, and he goes by the name of Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi lived in the 9th century of Islam, so early on. And he wrote a very small book or treatise called Masalih al-Abdan wal-Anfus. Now it's translated as Sustenance of the Body and Soul. And if you just look at the title alone, body and soul, today you would say this is a new age term called mind-body medicine. This is a new age thing. No, not at all. Because our scholars understood what only modern scientists today are starting to understand, that you can't separate the mind from the body. You can't separate the soul from the mind from the body. They're all connected together. Again, holistic tradition. And this is why this realm wasn't just dominated by physicians or those who worked on the physical. They were also dominated by the theologians and the people who worked on ihsan or spirituality, and those who worked and created a field that then became called ilmun nafs, right? The science of the nafs, of the soul, right? To really understand the self. And so al-Balkhi, back to him, in this book, I was amazed that in the 9th century, he wrote so intricately and articulately as he wrote. And one of the chapters in particular really caught my attention because I could see he was referring to what today we'd probably call depression. And then he referred to what we probably would call anxiety. There was even a section what we probably would call phobias, and I was amazed. Then there was a section and a word that we use often as Muslims called waswasa. And the waswasa, as you know, are the whisperings of the shaitan, and all people experience these, but al-Balkhi was talking about more than just the typical waswasa. He was talking about really grand and big waswasa that really interfered with a person's life. And as I was reading through this, I thought, subhanAllah, as a trained psychiatrist, I thought, I'm reading obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. In the 9th century, although when I went through training and in the works that I had studied in school, they said this illness did not exist until the 19th century. And the European person who discovered it, by Robert Burton, is his name. And I thought, what is this? And so I went down the hall to the expert of OCD at Stanford and knocked on his door and said, I think I found something here that may actually predate what we learn in our history books. And he said to me, no. can't be. I wrote the books of OCD. And I said, I know you wrote the books of OCD. And he has in there the Greeks and the Romans, and he's showing me the papers and so on that he's pulling from his shelf. And I said, but can you read Arabic? He said, no. And I said, well, maybe that's why it's missing. He said, fine, Go translate it. And so I did. And I sat and translated that first chapter, that chapter of OCD, and I came back to him with it. And when I showed him what I found, he was astounded. Before, he was a naysayer. No. But when I came back, he was astounded, because even if you take a look at the modern books in which we diagnose illnesses, for psychiatrists, that's the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatry, which is now in its 5th edition. And when you look at the criteria in which all physicians will diagnose OCD by and must, Al-Balkhi has each and every point, one by one, written in his book in the 9th century. And this doctor was astounded. And he's one of the forefathers of OCD in America. And so he said, you must publish this immediately. And I did. And the reason I did is because I felt, not only does it have to be in modern day mainstream medical literature, so that anybody who writes about OCD thereafter has to cite this, but also because to talk to our community as Muslims, who often say, no, this mental health story has nothing to do with us. No, we don't need that. That's a Western construct. But subhanAllah, my dear sisters and brothers, this is far from a Western construct. This is actually our tradition. And I'll tell you, it's not limited to Al-Balkhi. And when you think about, well, how did somebody like Al-Balkhi in the 9th century sit down and think about the illnesses, and the many like him, who sat down and thought about this? And it wasn't just theory for them. They actually created robust institutions of healing. And that's what I hope to get to by the end of our talk today, inshallah, that the brilliance of Balkhi and his ilk, they understood that there were psychological coping mechanisms, and they actually wrote about it. And years later, only now their brilliance appears. We didn't realize how much of our tradition we don't know and is buried in the dust of time. But where did they get their inspiration from? Why is it that in the Muslim lands, you had all of this golden age, when in the very same time period in Europe across the way was the Dark Ages? And we know for a fact that people who had mental illness were burned at the stake as witches in that period of time, at worst. And at best, they may have been sent to the monasteries to be healed by priests or nuns, because people believed these were purely religious issues. These were purely faith-based issues. But our scholars understood that faith and religion was one part of the problem, of the story, but not everything. It was what we today would call, in scientific terms today, multifactorial. Multiple causes could potentially lead to feeling this kind of distress and emotional turbulence. But look at the ahadith that inspired our scholars. In the Sahih of Bukhari, Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu narrates that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that there is no disease that Allah has created except that He has also created its remedy. This is beautiful. That means that any disease, any illness, including COVID, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down to humanity, He has taken an oath upon Himself that He will also send down its remedy. Sisters and brothers, remedies don't just fall from the sky. This is why there needs to be testing and figuring out, experimentation, science. This is why it takes time to find these things. Sometimes it takes years, and sometimes it happens quickly by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But He will not send down something to humanity that a burden more than they can bear. And also we find in Tirmidhi that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was asked, "O Messenger of Allah, shall we seek treatment for our illnesses?" The Sahaba asked him, and he replied, he said, "Yes, you should seek medical treatment, because Allah the Exalted has let no disease exist without providing its cure, except for one ailment, and that is old age. Nobody will be able to cure old age. We will all age. But every other illness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised that a cure will come." And that was the impetus, the spark that allowed our noble predecessors and scholars before us to not just theorize about these books and write great books, but actually to build beautiful institutions of healing that were holistic in nature. I'll tell you, sisters and brothers, most people I speak to in the Muslim community have no idea that the very first psychiatric hospitals in the world were created in the Muslim lands. The first it was psychiatric wards within a bigger hospital system, and then they became standalone institutions of healing that were holistic in nature. They went by the name Bimaristan, the place of healing, or Dar al-Shifa, right? The house or home of healing. And they were multiple institutions, and they started likely in Baghdad, most likely in the 8th century. And then they happened all throughout Muslim lands and all throughout Muslim history. And what's so beautiful about them is, I'll tell you, if you come to visit me today at Stanford Hospital, you're going to find that we have our team that rotates and visits every single patient every day. It's a multidisciplinary team, multiple different people who work in this would help the patient. Do you know that in the books that I was reading in the primary texts, that they describe these interdisciplinary teams from the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries? This last quarter at Stanford, I taught a class called Islamic psychology, which is amazing that this is the first of its like in a major university like Stanford University. As a class they're committed to teaching each and every year, inshallah. And it was an amazing class. And what I did for the students is, for their midterms, I assigned to them to each research a hospital from our Islamic era and tell me about the multidisciplinary team that existed then and the kind of treatment that happened for those who needed help, particularly mental health. Do you know what we found? We found teams that had the doctor, the nurse, the person today we might call a social worker, because they were the person who helped the patient come into the hospital and took care of their affairs, what they needed when they were in the hospital. And when the patient was discharged and done, they actually helped them resettle back into society. There was beautiful that they allowed a certain amount of dinars, gold dinars, a couple of them for when they discharged, so that when they were able to leave, they had clean clothing and food, and a few more dinars, 3 more, in order to build their own businesses, to integrate back into society. This is our tradition. The team had doctors, nurses, the person today we might call a social worker, the person who took care of the food and custom tailored it, so the dietitian, the person who worked on compounding medications, and yes, they used medications. Today we would call that the pharmacist, right? And then they had the person who gave religious advice, or wa'adh, nasiha, which today in a modern hospital you might call this the hospital chaplain. All of these people together would rotate on each and every patient in each and every bed in these hospital systems of the Islamic era. This is our tradition. In fact, even if you put it in Wikipedia, you'll find it says Islamic medicine was known to be humanistic medicine. These were novel treatments in which they created the things like music therapy, subhanAllah. People say music therapy, really, yes, the maqamat, because we study that in the recitation of Quran, in the adhan, right? When you're very turbulent, to help calm you down, and when you're very down, to help bring you back up, and refined in the Ottoman era, subhanAllah. And you look at the different massage therapies and music therapies and talk therapies that were developed by our scholars. And it wasn't limited to just the physical, but also the emotional and the psychological well-being. Now, even more importantly than all of that, sisters and brothers, is who funds this? How do you pay for all of this? And that is the beautiful thing about our tradition, that all of these services were paid by the Islamic government. They were paid by the Bayt al-Mal. This is where they got the money from the zakat funds that were collected, and from awqaf, endowments that were collected to fund these hospital systems, which meant that anybody that needed help or care was able to come and get this care free of charge, and be able to get back after they were healed, but get back on their feet and integrate back into society. And these institutions were not thrown off in some faraway place where out of sight, out of mind. No, these institutions were actually integrated in the center of the city. And in a traditional old city, you couldn't get from point A to point B unless you crossed the center of the city, right? The epicenter right there. And because of our Islamic tradition, that when you hear of somebody who is ill, it is sunnah to visit the sick or the ill. SubhanAllah, integrated into society. And it had beautiful fountains and greenery and things to help calm the turbulence. This is our tradition. Why do I keep harping on this? I keep harping on this point, my sisters and brothers, because for many of us, we don't even know this tradition. And for many more of us, we feel like the word mental health or emotional health is far away from us, or we feel that it is just strictly an issue of iman and faith alone. But I'll tell you, if our scholars had thought and believed and understood from the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah and from Islamic scholarship that it was merely supposed to be a faith-based issue, we would have done what the Europeans had done in the Dark Ages and sent all of our ill just to the shuyukh. Sounds a little like modern day, huh? But instead, our scholars actually understood holistic treatment, and they understood that there is a faith-based component, but there's also potentially a physical component, biological. In fact, they even wrote, they didn't know the word genes yet, genetics hadn't been discovered, but they understood that things can be passed down from generation to generation, therefore not the fault of anybody. It could be something that runs through your blood. They also understood the concept of the environmental, and you see this in the books of Balkhi and the like, who talk about specific techniques to mitigate environmental distress around you. Subhanallah. Subhanallah. This is incredible, incredible history and heritage that we have. How does that relate to the modern day? And why am I saying all of this? I'm saying this because here we are in America. And the stats, and Muslims are no exception to these stats, that 1 in 4 Americans will be touched by a clinical mental health condition at some point in their life. And to be honest with you, after COVID, who knows, these numbers might be even higher because of how much distress people have been feeling. And for anybody who says, no, that's not me, I can reassure you from all the research we've done on Muslim mental health, these numbers are accurate in our community too. Because in addition to everything else we're facing, we also face issues of Islamophobia and issues of acculturation and generation gaps and so on and so forth. But let me tell you something back to that number of 1 in 4. We all know more than 4 people in our lives. So take a moment with me and take a step back and think about how many people you know in your life. And think about how many of them, a quarter of them, have been touched by a clinical mental health condition, anxiety, depression, maybe OCD, maybe post-traumatic stress disorder. It could be anything, really. What does that mean for all of us? It means that even if you're from the 75%, the other 3 or 4, that does not get touched by a mental illness in your life, you are still a first responder. Why is that important? Because every study we've ever done that has ever been published on Muslims says that Muslims that experience any sort of emotional or mental turbulence are first going to go to their family. Not everybody, but many, the majority. And then number 2 would be friends. And in early studies, about 10 years ago or so, the studies were showing the third line were the imams. Now let me go back to family and friends. All of us have family and all of us have friends. So that means that even if we don't experience something, someone connected to us likely will in their lifetime and in ours. And the thing about imams, very interesting. It makes sense. But the research, and we're about to publish a really big study about to come out from the lab, inshallah, that's showing a different reversal of this trend, that it seems now that the younger generation that understands mental health more are probably more likely to go to the mental health providers first before they go to imams, which also makes a lot of sense because ultimately the mental health professionals are the professionals in this field. But nevertheless, and for that, I want to say congratulations to all the work that everyone has been doing in making sure that we go to the to the right category of people when we need stress. Because certainly we don't go to our imams when we have diabetes and are feeling kind of lightheaded and need to check our blood sugar. We know not to do that. We know to send people to the doctor, right? But somehow with mental health, we kind of skew things. We kind of go about, kind of have mixed messages and send them to the imam. But the imam isn't trained in mental health. Subhanallah, right? But there's so much more that the imams do, and they're incredibly important first-line responders, and so are we. And so I say this because that's 1 in 4 that might experience a clinical condition, but you have to know that the rest of us who may not experience a clinical condition, at some point in our life, we may experience other conditions that you don't diagnose, but still need help, like marital distress, parenting, issues, right? And certainly after COVID and quarantine, I think a lot of marriages and parenting has really been put to the test, right? Spouses don't come when you get married, they don't come with a manual of here is how my spouse functions and how I should communicate with them. That's something therapy can help with. And kids certainly are not born with manuals either, right? SubhanAllah. And so parenting is often a struggle for many of us, especially here. So I want to encourage everybody to look at the great work that's been done, to really celebrate with me. Let's congratulate and celebrate all the important work that's been done. Earlier, the Khalil Center was mentioned as a place that helps integrate Islam into modern day therapy. This is great progress. That's never been there before. And it's never been easier than ever before to seek the help of a Muslim mental health counselor. They're much more available than they ever used to be 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. There's been such a big difference. So when I end here, inshallah, I have 3 calls of action that I want us to think about and to really work on, inshallah. Think about this with me. With everything that I discussed already, think about how, number 1, we, as those frontline providers and those first-line responders, to know our limits and capacity. Sometimes, subhanAllah, we're well-meaning, but we end up in trying to give advice and to help the person in front of us, we end up saying the wrong thing or giving them the wrong advice because we are not the experts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught us in Surah An-Nahl, and He said, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, and ask the people of knowledge if you don't know. So we must turn to the people of knowledge, which takes me to number 2 in my call to action. We have to refer to the people of knowledge. Send your friends and family who come to you. Help them as much as you can, but know your limits and capacity. Refer them to those who can actually help them. And let's break down these taboos and stigma of getting care and help. And my 3rd call to action is in our masajids, in our communities, we have to have those who can help. So just like you think about a masjid and you think, okay, Friday prayers, you think, 5 daily prayers, you think Taraweeh, you think this is the place where I can give my zakatul fitr or my zakat, you think Sunday school. There's certain things we attach to the masjid in our American kind of, masjid understanding. Let's also attach mental health and well-being. Let's have staff in these masajid who can actually take care of and actually are professionals and licensed to do this work, or at the very least, have referral systems for those in our communities that need help, right? And there's beautiful models of this, and I'm happy to share at a different point in time, inshallah, different masajid and organizations that have done beautiful work in making sure that this is a reality. So in closing, I want to encourage all of us to let go of the taboo and stigma that plagues our communities and that is not in line with our tradition. Let us revive our lost legacy of holistic care, especially mental health care. And let us reclaim our rightful spot at the forefront of these efforts. We, if anybody, should be the movers and shakers and leaders in this story of holistic well-being, which includes mental and emotional health. It should be the Muslims, because it is in line with our great heritage and legacy. Our scholars of old understood that. Let's revive that tradition. Let's reclaim that rightful spot. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless me and you in the ability to do this and heal our community from the difficulties we're facing. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. والله تعالى أعلم. وبارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you so much, Dr. Rania, for your talk today. We greatly appreciate it, and we hope to see you again on this program, inshallah, in the next few weeks. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. For our audience today, thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate your presence as well. Inshallah, this Sunday, on 28th at 4 p.m., we are organizing another webinar with our interfaith partners and speakers from the Muslim community. The title of the program is going to be Dealing with Systemic Racism in the US and around the world. So please join us this Sunday at 4 p.m. You can find the links and information on our website at isna.net. Thank you so much. Take care. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.